It began with a whisper inside Buckingham Palace, small, controlled, and almost too dangerous to repeat. It began with a whisper inside Buckingham Palace, small, controlled, and almost too dangerous to repeat. Reports suggest one item from the Queen Mother's private jewel legacy had suddenly become the center of a silent royal confrontation. A Cartier bracelet Camilla was said to believe would pass naturally into her hands. But King Charles, weakened yet resolute, allegedly stopped the transfer cold. At first, it sounded like another quiet palace inventory matter, the kind of administrative review that usually disappears beneath layers of velvet protocol and careful silence. But this time, insiders whisper, something felt different. The review was not simply about checking boxes, confirming vault access, or updating old jewel records. It was about a bracelet connected to the Queen Mother, a piece wrapped in memory, rank, and royal expectation. And the moment Camilla's name was reportedly linked to its possible inheritance, the atmosphere changed. What may have begun as a private assumption soon became a test of power inside the House of Windsor. Because royal jewels are never just jewels. They are signals. They tell the world who belongs, who is trusted, and who has been allowed to step into the deepest circle of dynastic memory. Camilla, according to palace whispers, may have believed the bracelet would naturally fall within her personal inheritance circle, not as a grab for power, but as recognition of her place beside Charles after decades of loyalty, scandal, survival, and eventual coronation. Yet Charles, caught between affection and duty, reportedly saw something more dangerous beneath the surface. If the bracelet passed quietly into private hands, what would it mean for the Queen Mother's legacy? Would it remain a symbol of royal continuity or become another possession absorbed into a modern family network where sentiment could blur the line between crown and personal entitlement? That question, sources suggest, is what forced the king to pause. And once Charles paused, the silence around him began to fill with pressure. Princess Anne, long viewed as the iron guardian of royal tradition, was said to be quietly drawn toward the dispute. Prince William, already thinking like the future king, reportedly understood the warning instantly. A single bracelet could become a precedent. A private transfer could become a future argument. A jewel associated with one of the monarchy's most formidable matriarchs could suddenly become the center of a battle over legitimacy, memory, and control. For Camilla, it may have felt personal. For Charles, it had become institutional. And for the palace, the question was no longer whether a bracelet could be inherited, but whether the past could be protected from the desires of the present. To outsiders, it may have looked like diamonds, platinum, and Cartier craftsmanship. But inside the House of Windsor, reports suggest the bracelet carried something far heavier, the memory of Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, the Old Guard, and the sacred discipline of a monarchy that survived war, scandal, abdication, and grief. This was not simply a jewel. It was a relic of royal endurance. And that is why the alleged dispute struck such a dangerous nerve. In ordinary families, inheritance can be emotional, even messy. But inside the royal household, legacy is never handled like a private keepsake passed across a dinner table. Every jewel has a shadow. Every clasp, every stone, every locked case carries a message about rank, service, and belonging. The Queen Mother's world was built on restraint, duty, and a fierce belief that monarchy was not decoration. It was discipline. So when whispers began circulating that Camilla might be positioned to inherit the Cartier bracelet, those who understood the old rules reportedly felt the temperature shift at once. Because this bracelet was tied not merely to wealth, but to memory. It belonged to the era of Clarence House quiet authority, moral loyalty, and a royal court shaped by survival rather than softness. The Queen Mother had lived through abdication, war, widowhood, and national uncertainty. Yet she remained one of the monarchy's most powerful symbols of endurance. To place one of her most meaningful pieces into the wrong category, insiders suggest, would not simply be an administrative mistake. It would be a spiritual breach. It would suggest that a jewel connected to the Old Guard could be softened into personal reward rather than preserved as part of the crown's deeper story. And that is where King Charles reportedly faced the cruelest question of all. Was the bracelet a private token that could comfort Camilla? Or was it a sacred trust that had to remain protected from emotional claims? Different palace interpretations suggest Queen Elizabeth II may have left strict understandings around items linked to her mother, not always in loud legal language, but in that colder royal currency, expectation, precedent, and silence. Those who knew the late Queen's way of thinking understood that some things did not need to be shouted to be binding. For Camilla, the bracelet may have represented acceptance after a lifetime of judgment. For Anne and William, it reportedly represented something far more unforgiving, a boundary that could not be crossed without weakening the next reign before it even fully began. One wrong transfer could blur the line between crown heritage and personal privilege, between duty and desire, between the monarchy's memory and one woman's claim to recognition. And once that fear entered the room, the bracelet stopped sparkling and started warning everyone who touched the subject. Insiders whisper that Camilla did not demand the bracelet loudly. That would have been too obvious, too crude, too politically dangerous. Instead, the expectation allegedly moved through softer channels, private conversations, domestic inventories, sentimental claims, and the old language of loyalty. After decades beside Charles, Camilla may have believed the Queen Mother's bracelet was not a request. It was recognition. And in that quiet expectation, the danger reportedly began to form. Because Camilla's journey into the royal center had never been simple. She had endured public suspicion, private resistance, and years of careful repositioning until the coronation of 2023 appeared to seal what once seemed impossible, her place beside the king, crowned and acknowledged before the nation. So to those sympathetic to her, the bracelet may have seemed like a natural symbol of arrival, a final sign that the deepest chambers of royal memory had opened to her. But to others inside the palace, that very assumption carried a chilling warning. Palace aides reportedly began noticing subtle interest in Queen Mother-linked jewels, not as open pressure, but as delicate references, careful questions, and quiet attention to inventory language. Nothing dramatic enough to trigger alarm on its own. Nothing loud enough to become scandal. Yet inside the monarchy, power often moves through whispers before it becomes law. And the bracelet, once treated as a historic object, was suddenly being discussed as if it could become a personal emblem of Camilla's completed transformation from outsider to central royal figure. But that was precisely where the unease sharpened, because the Queen Mother's legacy did not belong only to sentiment. It belonged to a line of duty that ran through Elizabeth II, through Charles, and now toward William. Reports suggest some within the royal household feared that if the bracelet entered Camilla's private circle, questions would eventually follow. Would it remain tied to crown memory? Or could it one day drift closer to the Parker Bowles family line? Could an object loaded with royal history become vulnerable to personal inheritance claims? Could the palace accidentally create a precedent where proximity to power became stronger than service to the institution? That fear gave rise to colder whispers, jewels without the job, inheritance without institutional duty, phrases that reportedly cut through the private calm like blades. Charles, already burdened by illness, loyalty, and the weight of a fragile reign, began to sense that. Affection and monarchy were pulling in opposite directions. To comfort Camilla might satisfy the heart. To block the transfer might protect the crown. And in that painful divide, the bracelet became a test no one could escape. The turning point, according to palace interpretations, came through a red box review no one expected to become explosive. A routine examination of royal possessions reportedly uncovered language that made the bracelet impossible to treat casually. Suddenly, what Camilla may have viewed as sentimental inheritance became a matter of protocol, precedent, and institutional survival. The review was said to begin quietly, buried beneath the careful machinery of royal administration, where names are checked, records are compared, and old understandings are tested against the demands of a changing reign. But somewhere inside that process, according to palace whispers, the Queen Mother's Cartier bracelet stopped being a sentimental object and became a legal and symbolic warning. References reportedly emerged around Queen Elizabeth II's preferences for jewels tied to her mother. And while no one needed to raise their voice, the meaning was cold enough to shake the room. Some pieces could be worn, some could be loaned, some could be admired, but not every jewel could be absorbed into private expectation. That was where Prince Edward's role reportedly became critical. Long seen as the quiet sentinel of the royal fine print, Edward was not there to create drama. He was there to read what others ignored. And in a monarchy built as much on precedent as emotion, a single phrase in a record, a single classification, a single note linked to past royal intention could become stronger than any personal wish. Reports suggest Edward's careful attention gave weight to the argument that the bracelet belonged not to comfort, but to continuity. Then Princess Anne, with her iron sense of duty, allegedly pushed the matter further. To her, insiders claim, every historic jewel had to be placed in its proper category, not left floating in a dangerous gray zone where feeling could become entitlement. And understood what others feared saying aloud. Once one queen mother-linked piece slipped into private control, the next dispute would already be waiting. The palace would not just be protecting a bracelet. It would be protecting the line between service and possession. And so the phrase began to move quietly through the royal bloodstream, the Cartier Covenant. Not a public decree, not a dramatic announcement, but a palace doctrine built on one brutal principle, that jewels tied to dynastic memory must serve the crown before they soothe personal wounds. For Charles, the discovery reportedly made the choice both easier and more painful. He could no longer treat Camilla's expectation as harmless. The records had spoken. The old order had stirred. And the bracelet, once glittering in silence, had become a tripwire beneath the entire royal future. Then came the moment Camilla reportedly never expected. King Charles, often portrayed as torn between love and duty, allegedly chose the institution. The transfer was halted. The bracelet was frozen. And inside the palace, sources suggest the decision landed like a silent thunderclap. Because Charles had not merely denied Camilla a jewel. He had drawn a royal boundary. For a king already carrying the burden of illness, public duty, and a reign shadowed by unfinished family wounds, the choice was said to be agonizing. Camilla had stood beside him through scandal, rejection, and the long road to royal acceptance. She had waited years for the world to stop seeing her as an intruder and start seeing her as queen consort. So if the Queen Mother's Cartier bracelet represented anything to her, insiders suggest it was not merely luxury. It was proof. Proof that the old royal circle had finally opened. Proof that history had softened. Proof that the woman once kept outside the gates had been welcomed into the deepest chamber of Windsor memory. But Charles, according to palace interpretations, could not look at the bracelet only through the eyes of a husband. He had to look at it through the eyes of a king. And that changed everything. The reported block was not framed as anger. It was colder than that. It was protocol. The bracelet would not pass into private control. It would not become a personal possession. It would be placed under stricter royal jewel custody, protected by classification, precedent, and the quiet force of the Cartier Covenant. To palace aides, the message was unmistakable: duty over bloodline, crown over comfort, legacy over emotional reward. Camilla, sources whisper, was stunned by the coldness of the ruling. Not because she expected Charles to be reckless, but because she may have believed he would understand what the bracelet meant to her personally. Yet the monarchy has always been cruelest when it hides punishment behind procedure. No raised voice was needed. No public humiliation was announced. The decision itself was enough. A door had closed softly but permanently. And behind that door sat the truth Camilla could no longer avoid. Even a crowned queen consort could not override the sacred machinery of royal inheritance. And for Anne, William, and Edward, the ruling reportedly confirmed that the old order still had teeth. Charles had not simply preserved a bracelet. He had warned every branch of the family that proximity was not ownership and affection was not authority. What happened next reportedly transformed a private disappointment into bureaucratic warfare. Princess Anne, iron-willed and unforgiving when royal tradition is threatened, is said to have joined Prince William in tightening the rules around historic jewels. The message was unmistakable. The crown's treasures were not emotional consolation prizes. They belonged to the monarchy's future, not anyone's private circle. And once Anne entered the matter, the tone reportedly changed from quiet discomfort to cold enforcement. She was not moved by sentiment, not softened by domestic explanations, and not impressed by the idea that a jewel linked to the Queen Mother could be treated as a private token of emotional repair. To Anne, insiders suggest, the issue was brutally simple. If the bracelet carried royal memory, then it belonged under royal discipline. The Cartier Covenant, once only a whispered principle, began to harden into something far more serious. It became a wall. William, watching from the position of a future king, reportedly understood the danger with ruthless clarity. He was not only thinking about Camilla, Charles, or the present tension inside the palace. He was thinking about the reign to come. If historic jewels could drift into private hands now, what would stop future disputes over other pieces connected to the Queen Mother, Queen Elizabeth II, or the sacred geography of Windsor inheritance? What would happen when personal family claims collided with crown continuity again? For William, sources suggest, This was not cruelty. It was preparation. Then Edward, the quiet guardian of the fine print, was said to begin reviewing records connected to Clarence House, Balmoral, and the wider Royal Jewel Archives, not with drama, not with public statements, but with a kind of careful administrative force that can be more devastating than any confrontation. Access rules were allegedly rewritten, or at least reinforced. Custody lines were sharpened. Informal assumptions were scrubbed clean. Aides who once moved around historic possessions with comfortable familiarity reportedly began asking harder questions. Who had authority? Who had access? And who was merely tolerated near the edges of legacy? For Camilla, the consequence was subtle but cutting. Her influence over certain domestic royal possessions was said to be quietly reduced, not stripped in a public spectacle, but narrowed through procedure, classification, and silence. That is how the palace punishes without admitting punishment. It does not shout. It locks doors. It changes lists. It moves keys. It turns affection into paperwork and paperwork into power. And beneath it all, the monarchy began separating what Charles felt from what the crown required. Personal loyalty could remain. Marriage could remain. Public dignity could remain. But the bracelet and everything it represented would not be absorbed into anyone's private circle. And William had tightened the line. Edward had fortified the records. And Charles had allowed the machinery to move forward, even as the emotional cost deepened behind palace walls. For Camilla, reports suggest the humiliation was not public. But that made it worse. No cameras captured it. No announcement explained it. No official statement named it. Yet inside the palace, the symbolism was brutal. A queen consort crowned in 2023 had allegedly been blocked from claiming a queen mother jewel by the very king who once defended her place. And that silence, according to those familiar with palace moods, may have cut deeper than any public correction ever could. A public rebuke can be challenged, explained, softened by statements and carefully chosen words. But a private palace ruling sits differently. It becomes atmosphere. It becomes distance. It becomes the kind of quiet that tells everyone something has shifted, even when no one dares to say it aloud. Camilla, insiders whisper, handled the disappointment with control, but the wound was said to be deeply personal. Because this was not only about the bracelet. It was about what the bracelet seemed to say about her place after all these years. For decades, Camilla had moved from scandal to survival, from outsider to wife, from wife to queen consort. The coronation appeared to mark the final victory, the moment when the old resistance had finally given way. But the alleged block over the Cartier bracelet reminded palace circles of a harsher truth. Status is not the same as inheritance power. A crown on the head does not automatically unlock every vault. A title can command respect, but it cannot erase the sacred boundaries around legacy. And in that difference, the palace reportedly saw the real consequence of Charles's decision. Some within royal circles allegedly read the ruling as a quiet loss of influence for Camilla, a sign that her reach inside certain domestic and historical spaces had limits that could no longer be ignored. The concern, sources suggest, was not only about Camilla herself, but about what might happen beyond her. Her children's proximity to royal privilege had long been watched with careful attention, and the idea that a queen mother-linked jewel might one day drift toward a non-royal family line was enough to harden the old guard's resolve. That is where the phrase "the firm before the family" became more than palace language. It became a warning. Charles, by all interpretations, was emotionally caught in the center. To deny Camilla may have felt cruel. To allow the transfer may have looked reckless. So he chose the only path a king can choose when affection threatens institution. He stood with the crown. The bracelet became proof that even love must kneel before legacy, and that inside the House of Windsor, the greatest humiliations are often delivered without a single raised voice. By the end, the Cartier bracelet was no longer merely an object locked behind palace security. It had become a verdict. Reports suggest Charles's decision sent a message through every corridor of Windsor life. Royal legacy cannot be softened by marriage, redirected by sentiment, or inherited through proximity. The old guard had spoken, and Camilla had been reminded that the crown remembers everything. And in that reminder, the entire dispute found its final meaning. The bracelet, once whispered about as a possible personal inheritance, reportedly remained protected within the colder architecture of royal continuity. It was no longer treated as a sentimental prize, no longer vulnerable to private expectation, no longer drifting between affection and entitlement. It had been pulled back into the guarded world of the crown, where memory is preserved not because it is beautiful, but because it is dangerous when mishandled. Charles's alleged block became more than a husband denying a wife. It became a king choosing duty over private loyalty at the very moment when softness would have been easier. The outcome left a complicated truth behind. Camilla still had status. She still had position. She still stood beside the king in the official order of royal life. But reports suggest this ruling made one thing painfully clear. Status does not equal command over sacred legacy pieces. There are jewels that can decorate a reign, and there are jewels that define a dynasty. The Queen Mother's Cartier bracelet belonged to the second category, and once that distinction hardened, even Camilla's place could not alter it. And William and Edward reportedly emerged from the episode as guardians of the next royal order, and with her iron discipline, William with his future-focused caution, Edward with his quiet command of the fine print. Together they represented a colder, stricter monarchy, one determined to prevent emotional claims from weakening institutional memory. And behind them, almost like an invisible force, stood Queen Elizabeth II and the Queen Mother, their influence still moving through records, customs, expectations, and the unspoken laws of Windsor survival. It was as if the past had reached forward and closed its hand around the bracelet before the present could claim it. That is why this story cut so deeply. It was never only about diamonds. It was about whether the crown remains a sacred trust or becomes a family business. And according to palace whispers, Charles's answer was brutal, final, and impossible to mistake. The bracelet would not be taken by desire. It would not be softened by marriage. It would remain where legacy demanded it remain. And as the palace doors closed around the Cartier bracelet, one truth remained colder than diamonds. Legacy belongs not to the person who wants it most, but to the institution strong enough to protect it. Claude is AI and can make mistakes.